Cedarwood, a small, quiet town nestled in the mountains, had always been a peaceful place. The crime rate was low, the streets were safe, and the community was tight-knit. The local police station was a modest brick building, staffed by a handful of officers who spent more time dealing with lost pets than violent crimes. But that all changed one winter night when something unspeakable found its way into their lives. Officer Sarah Miller had been with the Cedarwood Police Department for nearly 5 years. She was known for her calm demeanor and dedication to the job. On a cold, snowy night in January, she was assigned the overnight shift at the station. It was usually a quiet shift, with nothing more than a few routine patrols and the occasional check-in. But that night was different. Sarah sat at her desk, sipping on a cup of coffee, the steam rising in the chill of the room. The old radiator in the corner clanked and hissed, struggling to keep the station warm. The snow outside fell in heavy sheets, piling up against the windows. She glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. The radio crackled occasionally with static, but there had been no calls, no emergencies, just silence. The silence was broken by the sound of the front door creaking open. Sarah looked up, surprised. No one usually came to the station this late unless there was an emergency. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the falling snow. As the person stepped inside, Sarah saw it was a young woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, standing up. The woman nodded, her lips trembling. "I need to report a crime," she whispered. Sarah motioned for her to come closer, guiding her to a chair. "What happened?" The woman took a deep breath, her hands shaking. "My name is Emily Brooks," she began. "I live out on Harper Road near the old Johnson farm. Earlier tonight, I heard something outside my house. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I saw someone standing in my yard watching me." Sarah listened, her expression serious. "Did you get a good look at them?" Emily shook her head. "No, it was too dark, but I could feel them watching me. And then I heard the whispers." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "Whispers?" "Yes," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Voices, so many voices all around me. They were saying my name, telling me to come outside. I was so scared. I locked all the doors and called my neighbor, but no one answered, so I came here." Sarah nodded, trying to stay calm. "Okay, we'll send someone out to check your property. In the meantime, you're safe here. Can you stay for a while?" Emily nodded, relief washing over her face. Sarah picked up the radio, calling for backup. "This is Officer Miller at Cedarwood Station. I need a unit to check out a possible intruder at 342 Harper Road. Be advised, the suspect may still be on the premises." "Over." A voice crackled back. "Copy that, Officer Miller. Unit 3 en route. Over." Sarah turned back to Emily, offering a reassuring smile. "We'll figure this out. Can I get you anything? Coffee, maybe?" Emily shook her head. "No, thank you. I just want to feel safe." Sarah nodded and walked over to the window, peering out into the night. The snow was falling harder now, the wind howling through the trees. The station felt colder than usual, the shadows longer. She tried to shake off the unease creeping into her thoughts. The minutes passed slowly. Sarah checked her watch, wondering what was taking Unit 3 so long. She picked up the radio again. "Unit 3, what's your status?" "Over." There was no response, just static. "Unit 3, do you copy?" "Over," Sarah repeated, her voice more urgent. Still nothing. She looked at Emily, who was staring at the floor, her eyes distant. "Stay here," Sarah said, grabbing her coat. "I'm going to check outside." As Sarah stepped into the cold, she felt a strange sensation, as if she were being watched. The snow crunched under her boots as she walked around the station, scanning the darkness. The wind carried a faint sound, almost like whispering. She turned quickly, shining her flashlight into the shadows, but saw nothing. "Hello?" she called out, her breath visible in the frigid air. No answer. She moved to the back of the building where the patrol cars were parked. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw Unit 3's car, its lights off, the doors open. "Officer Barnes?" she called, her voice echoing in the silence. She approached the car, shining her light inside. It was empty, the radio hissing with static. A sense of dread filled her. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She turned to head back inside when she saw it. A figure standing in the doorway of the station, staring at her. For a moment she thought it was Emily, but then she realized the figure was too tall, its shape wrong. The figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing from view. "Hey!" Sarah shouted, running towards the door. She burst into the station, her hand on her gun. "Emily?" The front room was empty, the chair where Emily had sat now vacant. Sarah's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the intruder. The whispering started again, soft at first, then growing louder, filling the air with hissing voices. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She followed the sound down the hallway, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The station felt different, the walls closing in, the air thick with something unseen. The whispers grew louder, almost chanting now. She reached the holding cells at the back of the station, her flashlight revealing empty, cold metal bars. The door to the last cell was ajar. As she approached, a figure lunged out at her from the darkness. Sarah jumped back, her gun drawn, ready to fire. But it was Emily, her eyes wide with terror, her hands clutching the bars. "Please!" Emily cried. "They're here! They're here!" Sarah tried to calm her. "Who's here, Emily? What's going on?" Emily's voice was shaking. The voices. "They won't stop. They're coming for us. They want us to join them." Sarah turned, scanning the hallway. The whispers were all around, echoing off the walls. She felt a presence, something cold and malevolent. She reached for her radio, but the static was louder now, the voices merging into one. "Officer Miller," a voice whispered through the static, low and haunting. "Join us." Sarah froze. The voice was familiar. She had heard it before, in her nightmares, in the darkness. It was the voice of someone who had died, someone she had lost, her brother, who had vanished years ago, his body never found. "Sarah," the voice called again, more insistent. "Come with us." Tears filled her eyes. "No," she whispered. "You're not real." But the voice laughed, echoing in the darkness. "We are real. We are here. We are waiting." The station lights flickered, plunging the hallway into darkness. Sarah's flashlight sputtered and died. She was surrounded by the whispers, the voices closing in, filling her mind with their chilling song. Emily screamed, a sound that cut through the air like a knife. Sarah turned, but she was alone. Emily was gone, vanished into the shadows. Panic set in as the walls seemed to close around her. She stumbled back down the hallway, trying to find the exit, the way out. But the station had changed. The hallways twisted and turned, leading her in circles. Doors appeared where they hadn't been before, opening into empty rooms filled with shadows. The whispers followed her, growing louder, mocking her fear. "Sarah," the voices called, "come with us, be one of us." She felt a hand on her shoulder, cold and skeletal. She turned, but no one was there. She ran, her heart racing, desperate to escape. The whispers became a roar, drowning out her thoughts, her screams. She burst through a door and found herself back in the front room, the snow still falling outside. The station was empty, silent. She staggered to her desk, grabbing the phone, trying to call for help. But the line was dead. The dial tone replaced by the whispers. "Please," she cried, "someone help me." The front door creaked open, a gust of wind blowing snow into the room. Sarah turned, her eyes wide with fear. The figure stood in the doorway again, its face hidden in shadow. "Sarah," it whispered, stepping inside, "it's time to join us." She backed away, her hand on her gun, but it was too late. The whispers filled her mind, erasing her thoughts, her will. The figure moved closer, its face becoming clear. It was her brother, his eyes empty, his mouth twisted into a smile. "Welcome home," he said. Sarah's scream echoed through the empty station, fading into the night as the door swung shut. The snow continued to fall, covering cedarwood in a silent white blanket. The whispers died away, leaving nothing but the wind and the darkness. Cedarwood would wake the next morning to find the police station empty, its officers gone, vanished without a trace. The town would mourn, searching for answers that would never come, and the whispers would wait, silent and patient, for their next victim. There's a stretch of road on the outskirts of Black Hollow that everyone in town knows to avoid after dark. It's called Whispering Woods Road, named for the dense, twisted forest that surrounds it. Rumors have circulated for decades. Disappearances, strange sounds, shadowy figures seen out of the corner of one's eye. But most people dismiss it as urban legend, all except the local police, who know the truth all too well. Officer Mark Higgins was new to Black Hollow, transferred from a big city precinct to what he thought would be a quieter life. It wasn't long before he heard about Whispering Woods Road. His colleagues shared stories over coffee and donuts, recounting eerie tales of lost hikers and ghostly sightings. Mark laughed it off, considering it nothing more than small-town superstition. But that changed one rainy autumn night. It was just past midnight when the call came in. An accident on Whispering Woods Road. A car overturned, the driver missing. Dispatch was vague, static crackling through the radio, but Mark got enough to know he was needed. He grabbed his keys and headed out, rain pelting his windshield as he drove towards the woods. The road was narrow and winding, barely visible under the thick canopy of trees. Mark's headlights struggled to cut through the darkness, the rain making everything slick and shiny. He felt a chill run down his spine as he spotted the flickering hazard lights of the wrecked car. It lay on its side, crumpled against a tree. He pulled over, turning on his flashlight as he stepped out into the storm. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the rain and the howling wind. There was no answer. He approached the car, peering inside. The driver's seat was empty, the door hanging open, blood smeared the steering wheel, and Mark felt his pulse quicken. He scanned the area, looking for any sign of the driver. That's when he heard it, a faint whispering, like the rustle of leaves or a voice carried on the wind. Mark turned towards the sound, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He saw nothing but trees, branches swaying in the storm. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. He took a step towards the woods, hesitating. "Is anyone there?" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. The whispering stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then from the shadows a figure emerged. It was a man soaked to the bone, his clothes torn and bloody. He stumbled towards Mark, eyes wide with fear. "Help me," he gasped. "They're coming. They're coming for me." Mark rushed to the man's side, catching him as he collapsed. "What happened?" he asked, trying to steady him. They were in the road," the man stammered, shaking. "I tried to swerve, but they were everywhere. They whispered my name." Mark felt a chill. "Who was in the road?" he asked. The man's eyes darted around, his breathing rapid. The children," he whispered. "The missing children. They're in the woods. They're calling for help, but it's a trap. They want us in there with them." Mark's blood ran cold. He had heard the stories. Children who had disappeared near Whispering Woods, their bodies never found. He glanced towards the dark line of trees, half expecting to see pale faces staring back at him. "Stay here," he told the man, reaching for his radio. "I'm calling for backup." But as he raised the radio to his mouth, the whispering returned, louder this time. It seemed to come from all directions, surrounding him. He turned, shining his flashlight into the woods. Shadows danced between the trees, and Mark's hand trembled. "Officer Higgins, come in," a voice crackled through the radio. "Mark, are you there?" Mark hesitated, his eyes fixed on the woods. "I'm here," he said, his voice shaking. "I've got a man who's been in an accident. He says there are children in the woods." Silence. Then the voice on the radio spoke again, lower this time. "Mark, listen to me. Get out of there now." "What? Why?" Mark asked, confused. "The children, they're not real," the voice said. "It's the woods. They make you see things, hear things. They lure you in. No one who goes in there comes back." Mark's heart pounded. He looked at the man beside him, still muttering about the children. The whispering grew louder, and he thought he saw movement in the trees. "We have to go," Mark said, grabbing the man's arm. "Now!" But the man pulled away, shaking his head. "No," he cried. "I have to save them. I have to save the children." Before Mark could stop him, the man broke free, running towards the woods. Mark shouted after him, but the whispering drowned out his voice. He watched, helpless, as the man disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the trees. Mark stood frozen, fear gripping him. The whispering was all around him now, a chorus of voices calling his name, urging him to follow. He took a step back, then another, his heart racing. He turned and ran to his car, throwing himself inside and locking the doors. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and started the engine. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment he thought he saw figures standing at the edge of the woods, watching him leave. Pale faces, eyes dark and empty, mouths moving in silent whispers. Mark didn't stop until he reached the station, his heart still pounding. He stumbled inside, drenched and shaking. His colleagues looked up, concern in their eyes. "Mark, what happened?" one of them asked. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. All he could hear was the whispering echoing in his mind. He knew he would never forget it, never be free of it. The woods had a hold on him now, their whispers a part of him. And as the rain poured outside, Mark realized the truth. Whispering Woods would always call him back, its dark secrets never letting him go. The road was cursed, and so was he. The Pine Hill police station stood at the edge of the town, a modest red brick building with a few aging patrol cars parked outside. Officer Jake Turner had worked there for 10 years, and tonight he was on the midnight shift, the graveyard shift as they called it. The town of Pine Hill was quiet, surrounded by dense woods, and most nights, nothing much happened. That's what Jake liked about it. No drama, no surprises. But that was before the phone call that changed everything. It was a cold October night, the kind of night where the chill seemed to seep into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. Jake sat behind his desk, flipping through a magazine, the hum of the fluorescent lights above providing the only sound. He glanced at the clock. Midnight had come and gone. 2 more hours and he'd be done. 2 more hours and he could go home, have a beer, and get some sleep. The phone rang, shattering the silence. Jake picked it up, half expecting it to be a prank or some drunk needing a ride. "Pine Hill Police Department," he answered. There was a pause, and then a woman's voice, low and trembling. "You have to help me," she whispered. "Please." Jake sat up, suddenly alert. "Ma'am, what's your name?" "Rebecca," she said, her voice barely audible over what sounded like static. "Rebecca Harlow. I'm at the old Ellis house. You need to come. He's here. He's trying to get in." Jake frowned. The Ellis house had been abandoned for years, ever since old Mr. Ellis had died. Kids in town talked about it being haunted, but it was just a creepy, run-down building. "Rebecca, are you alone? Who's trying to get in?" There was a sound like a door creaking, and then Rebecca's voice again, more urgent. "Please, hurry, he's here." The line went dead. Jake grabbed his radio, calling for backup, but there was no response. Officer Williams, his partner, was out on patrol, probably checking on some noise complaint on the other side of town. Jake cursed under his breath, grabbed his flashlight, and headed out into the night. The Ellis house was only a 10-minute drive. As Jake drove, the wind picked up, rattling the bare branches of the trees that lined the road. He turned down the narrow dirt path leading to the house, his headlights cutting through the darkness. The old 2-story house loomed ahead, its windows like dark eyes staring out into the night. Jake pulled up, his tires crunching on the gravel. He killed the engine and stepped out, his breath visible in the cold air. The wind howled, and for a moment, he thought he heard someone whispering. He shook it off and approached the house, his flashlight in one hand, the other resting on the gun at his hip. "Rebecca," he called out, his voice echoing in the night. "Pine Hill Police. Are you here?" Silence. The only sound was the creaking of the house as the wind battered its old wooden frame. Jake tried the front door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open, the door groaning on its hinges. The inside was dark, colder than the night outside. His flashlight beam swept across the dusty floor, revealing broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, and cobwebs. "Rebecca," he called again, stepping inside. The door slammed shut behind him, making him jump. He turned, but the door was still. Just the wind, he told himself. Just the wind. He moved through the house, the floorboards creaking under his boots. A staircase led to the second floor, its steps covered in dust. Jake climbed, the wood groaning under his weight. He reached the top and paused. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. A door at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar, faint light flickering inside like the glow of a candle. Jake approached, his flashlight shaking slightly. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty except for a single candle burning on a windowsill, casting long shadows on the walls. The air was cold, colder than outside, and Jake could see his breath. On the floor was a piece of paper, yellowed with age, covered in writing. Jake picked it up, his hands trembling. The writing was in ink, dark and smeared as if written in a hurry. It read, "He's coming. He never left. The house is his. We are all his." A sudden creak behind him made Jake spin around. The door to the room was closing slowly on its own. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He rushed to the door, but it slammed shut before he could reach it. He grabbed the handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. "Rebecca," he shouted, pounding on the door. "Rebecca, if you're here, answer me." No response, just the sound of his own breathing, loud in the silence. And then the whispering started. It was soft at first, like the rustle of leaves, but it grew louder, filling the room. Jake pressed his ear against the door, straining to hear. The whispers were coming from the other side, a jumble of voices overlapping, saying things he couldn't understand. He backed away, his eyes darting around the room. The candle flickered, the shadows on the walls seeming to move. Jake's mind raced. What was happening? This couldn't be real. He had to get out. He grabbed his radio. "This is Officer Turner. I'm at the Ellis house. I'm trapped. Is anyone there?" His voice cracked with fear. Static. No response. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He turned, and for the first time, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A mirror, covered in dust, hung on the wall opposite the window. His reflection stared back at him, pale and wide-eyed. But then the reflection smiled. Jake stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, except for the flickering candle. The reflection in the mirror moved closer, its smile widening, its eyes dark. Empty voids. "Jake," the voice whispered. But it wasn't his voice. It was deeper, colder. "Jake, join us." The door flew open with a bang, slamming against the wall. Jake turned, his heart in his throat. A figure stood in the doorway, a shadow against the light from the hallway. It stepped forward, and Jake saw the face of a man, pale and gaunt, eyes sunken, his mouth twisted into a smile. "Jake," the man whispered, his voice like gravel. "We've been waiting for you." Jake's mind screamed to run, but his body was frozen. The man stepped closer, the air around him growing colder. Jake felt his breath leaving him, the room spinning. The man's eyes bored into him, dark, endless pits. "You can't leave," the man said, his voice filling Jake's head. "The house won't let you. You belong to us now." The candle flickered, the light dimming. Jake felt his knees buckle, his vision blurring. The whispering was deafening now, a cacophony of voices all saying his name. And then everything went black. When Officer Williams arrived at the Ellis house the next morning, he found Jake's patrol car parked outside, its engine cold. He called out, but received no response. The front door was open, creaking in the breeze. Inside, the house was empty, silent except for the faint creaking of the floorboards. Williams called for backup, but there was no sign of Jake or anyone else. Just an empty house and the cold wind blowing through the broken windows. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A piece of paper lying on the floor by the staircase. He picked it up, his hands trembling. It was yellowed with age, the writing dark and smeared. It read, "He's coming. He never left. The house is his. We are all his." Williams felt a chill run down his spine. He dropped the paper, his eyes darting around the empty room. He thought he heard something, a faint whispering just at the edge of hearing. He shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling of dread. But as he stepped outside, he thought he saw something in the window, a face, pale and smiling, watching him leave. The town of Pine Hill never saw Officer Jake Turner again. The Ellis house remained empty, abandoned, a place where shadows moved and whispers lingered. The locals spoke of the haunted house at the edge of town, the house that took people and never let them go. And on cold, windy nights, if you listened closely, you could hear the whispers calling your name, waiting for you to join them. Megan had been a 911 dispatcher for 6 years, and she thought she had heard it all. From drunk teenagers trying to prank the emergency line to terrified mothers reporting break-ins. She had managed to keep her calm through it all, but nothing had prepared her for the call she received that rainy October night. The storm outside was fierce. Thunder boomed, and lightning flashed across the sky, momentarily illuminating the quiet streets of Brooksville. The small town didn't see much action, which was just how Megan liked it. Her shift had been uneventful so far, and she hoped to keep it that way until her replacement showed up. Megan sipped her lukewarm coffee, yawning as she stared at the computer screens in front of her. The steady rain drumming against the window had a soothing, almost hypnotic effect, and she found her eyelids growing heavy. Just as she was about to drift off, the phone rang, jolting her awake. 911, what's your emergency? Megan answered, straightening in her chair. There was a pause on the other end, just static at first, then the faint sound of breathing. Hello? Megan said, her voice firmer. This is 911. Do you need help? Finally, a voice came through, shaky and barely audible. Yes, I need help. It was a woman, and she sounded terrified. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. Ma'am, what's your name? Megan asked, already typing a note into her system. Linda, the woman replied. Linda Keller. Please, you have to help me. There's someone in my house. Megan's heart rate quickened. Linda, where are you right now? I'm hiding in my closet, Linda whispered. I can hear him downstairs. He's calling my name. Megan's fingers flew over the keyboard as she entered Linda's information. Stay calm, Linda. I'm dispatching officers to your location. Can you stay on the line with me? Yes, but please hurry, Linda pleaded. He's getting closer. I can hear his footsteps. Megan hit the button to alert Officer Daniels, the nearest available unit. Unit 2, we have a possible intruder at 87 Maple Street. Respond immediately. Daniels' voice crackled over the radio. This is Unit 2. I'm en route. Megan turned her attention back to the call. Linda, can you tell me anything about the intruder? Do you know him? No, Linda said, her voice trembling. I've never seen him before. He just showed up. He keeps saying my name over and over. Megan felt a chill run down her spine. Do you have any way to protect yourself? A weapon? No, nothing, Linda replied. Please, just get here. I'm so scared. Megan listened intently, trying to hear any background noise that might give her a clue about the intruder's location. All she could hear was Linda's ragged breathing and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Linda, stay with me, Megan said, her voice calm. The police are on their way. Just keep quiet and don't make any noise. The silence stretched on, broken only by the storm outside. Megan could hear the rain pounding against the roof, the wind howling. Then faintly she heard it, a man's voice, low and mocking, calling out, Linda! Linda! Megan's blood ran cold. The voice was chilling, filled with a cruel edge. Linda let out a small whimper, barely able to contain her fear. He's right outside the door, Linda whispered. I can see his shadow under the door. Stay quiet, Linda, Megan urged. Help is almost there. Just hold on a little longer. There was a sudden loud noise, the sound of a door being flung open, followed by Linda's scream. The line went dead, replaced by a high-pitched, droning dial tone. Linda! Megan shouted into the phone. Linda! Frantic, she switched to the radio. Unit 2, what's your ETA? Daniels responded, his voice calm. About 2 minutes out. What's going on? I think the intruder is in the house, Megan said, her voice shaking. I just lost contact with the caller. Get there fast. The next 2 minutes felt like an eternity. Megan stared at the clock, willing the time to pass faster. She tried calling Linda back, but the phone just rang and rang. Finally, Daniel's voice crackled over the radio again. This is Unit 2. I'm on scene. Megan let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. Thank God. Daniels, be careful. The intruder might still be inside. There was a pause, then Daniels came back on the line. Dispatch, the front door is open. I'm going in. Megan listened intently, every muscle in her body tense. She heard Daniels moving through the house, calling out, Police! Is anyone here? Silence followed, then a thud and a muffled curse. Megan's heart skipped a beat. Daniels, what's happening? There was a long pause before Daniels spoke again, his voice tight. I found Linda. She's dead. Looks like she's been stabbed multiple times. There's no sign of the intruder. Megan felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Oh God, she whispered. Daniels, get out of there. I'm sending backup. As Megan reached for the radio to call for more units, Daniel's voice came through again, this time lower, almost hesitant. "There's something else, dispatch. There's something written on the wall in blood." Megan swallowed, trying to steady her voice. "What does it say?" Daniel's voice was barely a whisper now. "It says, 'You're next, Megan.'" Megan's blood turned to ice. She dropped the phone, her hands trembling, her mind raced. How could this be happening? How did the intruder know her name? The room felt suddenly too small, too quiet. Megan's eyes darted around, expecting to see a shadow move in the corners. She picked up the phone with a shaky hand and called for all available units to her location. Her own breathing was loud in her ears, each second stretching out into an eternity. She waited, heart pounding, staring at the door, expecting it to fly open at any moment. The rain continued to pour outside, the storm intensifying. Thunder rumbled, shaking the windows. A noise came from the hallway. Megan froze, every muscle in her body tensed. She heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. The doorknob turned and the door creaked open. Megan reached for her desk drawer, pulling out her service revolver, her hands shaking. The door swung wide and a figure stepped inside. It was Daniels, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "Daniels!" Megan gasped, lowering her gun. "You scared the hell out of me." Daniels shook his head, his voice trembling. "Megan, we need to get out of here now." "What's going on?" Megan demanded, her heart still racing. "There's no sign of the intruder," Daniel said, his voice unsteady. But I found this in Linda's hand." He held up a crumpled piece of paper. Megan took it, her hands trembling. She unfolded it, the paper stained with blood. The words were scrawled hastily, almost illegible. "He's not alone. They're everywhere. Run." Megan felt the room spin. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening. She looked up at Daniels, her voice barely a whisper. "What does this mean?" Before Daniels could answer, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Megan's heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled for her flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. The whispering started, low and sinister, coming from all around. Megan's breath caught in her throat. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and swirling. Daniels backed away, his eyes wide with terror. "Megan, we need to leave now," he shouted, his voice cracking. Megan nodded, grabbing her radio. "All units, this is dispatch. We have a situation at headquarters. I repeat, we need backup now." The whispering grew louder, filling the room, echoing off the walls. Megan felt something brush against her arm, cold and clammy. She turned, but nothing was there, just empty air. Daniels grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. "Come on, Megan." They ran down the hallway, the whispers following them, growing louder, more insistent. Megan's mind raced, her thoughts a jumbled mess. Who were they? What was happening? They burst through the front door into the pouring rain, the storm raging around them. The whispering was still there, riding on the wind, calling her name. Megan looked around the dark parking lot, empty, the streetlights flickering. "Where are they?" she shouted over the howling wind. "Where's backup?" Daniel shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know. They should have been here by now." A flash of lightning lit up the night, and for a brief moment, Megan saw them. Figures standing in the shadows surrounding the station, their faces hidden, their eyes glowing in the dark. "They're here," she whispered, backing away, her heart hammering in her chest. The figures moved closer, the whispering growing louder, a cacophony of voices all saying her name. Megan's hands shook as she raised her gun, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. The darkness pressed in, the storm raging around them, and the last thing she heard was the sound of her own name, whispered over and over. And then there was silence. The next morning, the town of Brooksville woke to find the police station empty. No sign of Megan, Daniels, or anyone else. Just the storm-battered building, doors wide open, and the faint echo of whispers in the wind. Officer David Cole had been working the night shift in the quiet town of Birch Hollow for nearly 5 years. He enjoyed the tranquility, the solitude, and the sense of calm that came with working in a place where nothing ever really happened. Tonight was one of those nights. The streets were empty, the air was crisp, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves as the autumn wind swept through the small, sleepy town. It was nearing midnight, and David was parked near the edge of the town, his cruiser hidden in the shadows of a large oak tree. He sipped his coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him, fighting off the chill that the night brought. He was about to call it in and take one last round before heading back to the station when his radio crackled to life. "Unit 4, this is dispatch. Do you copy?" The voice of Kathy, the night dispatcher, came through slightly distorted by static. David picked up the radio. "This is Unit 4. What's up, Kathy?" "David, we've got a 1031 possible burglary in progress at 238 Maple Street. Caller reported seeing someone breaking into the house," Kathy said, her voice unusually tense. David frowned. Maple Street was on the far side of town, where the old houses stood abandoned for years. No one lived there anymore. "Are you sure about that address? Those houses have been empty for ages." "That's the address," Kathy confirmed. The caller was pretty insistent, said they saw a light on and someone moving around inside. David sighed. "All right, I'm on my way. Keep the line open just in case." "Will do." "Stay safe out there," Kathy replied. David started the cruiser and pulled out onto the deserted road. As he drove through the quiet streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Birch Hollow was the kind of place where nothing much ever happened, especially not in the middle of the night. He turned onto Maple Street, the old houses looming in the darkness like silent sentinels. Their windows were dark, and the yards were overgrown with weeds. He pulled up to 238 Maple Street, an old Victorian house that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the shutters hung crooked, and the yard was a tangled mess of overgrown bushes and dead leaves. The only sign of life was a faint light coming from one of the upstairs windows. David grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the cruiser. The wind had picked up, and the trees around the house rustled, their branches creaking. He walked up the cracked pathway to the front door, his boots crunching on the gravel. The air was heavy, and David felt a shiver run down his spine. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the empty halls inside. "Police! Is anyone here?" he called out, his voice steady, but there was no response. David tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open, and it creaked on its hinges, revealing a dark, musty hallway. The air inside was stale, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. David stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam swept over dust-covered furniture, old picture frames, and a long-abandoned coat rack. "Hello, this is Officer Cole with the Birch Hollow Police Department. Is anyone here?" He called out again, his voice echoing through the empty house. Still no answer. David moved deeper into the house, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He made his way to the staircase, the wood groaning under his weight as he ascended. The light he had seen from outside was coming from a room at the end of the hall. As he got closer, he could see that the door was slightly ajar, a faint yellow light spilling into the hallway. David approached the door, his heart beating faster. He pushed it open with the tip of his flashlight and stepped inside. The room was empty except for an old rocking chair that sat in the corner, slowly moving back and forth as if someone had just been sitting there. A single candle burned on the windowsill, its flame flickering in the draft. David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the room with his flashlight. "Hello, is anyone here?" he called out, his voice breaking the heavy silence. Suddenly, the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. David spun around, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. He ran to the door and yanked it open, his heart pounding. The hallway was empty, just as he had left it. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself. He was a seasoned officer, not some rookie spooked by an old house. He turned back to the room, planning to extinguish the candle when he heard it. A faint whispering, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. David froze, listening. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from behind him. He turned, his flashlight aimed at the source of the sound. The rocking chair had stopped moving, but in its place stood a figure, shadowy and indistinct, its features obscured by the darkness. David's hand went to his gun, his fingers brushing the handle. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady but his heart racing. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. The whispering continued, filling the room with a chilling, hollow sound. David felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He took a step back, his hand tightening around his gun. "I said, 'Who are you?'" he repeated, his voice rising. The figure finally moved, stepping forward into the light. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes dark and empty. Her lips moved, but the whispering seemed to come from all around, echoing off the walls. "Leave," she said, her voice a hollow echo. "Leave now." David's heart was in his throat. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. He turned and ran, bursting through the door and down the hallway. He didn't stop until he was outside, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He fumbled with the radio on his shoulder. "This is Unit 4, he panted. "I need backup at 238 Maple Street. There's—" He stopped, realizing how insane he would sound. "There's someone here. Just get here now." He ran to his cruiser, locking the doors behind him. He kept his eyes on the house, half expecting the woman to appear in the doorway. Minutes passed, feeling like hours, before he saw the flashing lights of another patrol car. Officer Riley stepped out, looking around with a puzzled expression. "David, what's going on? Are you okay?" Riley asked, approaching the cruiser. David opened the door, his hands still shaking. "There's someone in the house, a woman. She told me to leave." Riley frowned. "A woman? David, those houses have been empty for years. No one's lived here since—" He trailed off, his eyes widening as he looked past David toward the house. David turned, following Riley's gaze. The front door was open, and standing in the doorway was the woman, her pale face illuminated by the moonlight. Her eyes were fixed on David, dark and unblinking. Riley took a step back.
"David, get in the car,"
he said quietly. David didn't need to be told twice. He climbed into the cruiser, slamming the door behind him. Riley did the same, and they both stared at the house, the figure in the doorway slowly fading back into the darkness. David's radio crackled to life.
Unit 4, this is dispatch. What's your status?
David picked up the radio, his voice shaking.
"Kathy, you need to get someone else down here. There's something wrong with this place."
There was a pause, then Kathy's voice came back, confused.
David, I didn't send a call to 238 Maple Street. I haven't had any calls all night.
David felt his blood run cold.
"What? Kathy, I got a call about a break-in. You said—"
Kathy cut him off.
David, I didn't send you there. You called me.
David's mind raced. That was impossible. He had heard Kathy's voice on the radio, had responded to the call. He looked over at Riley, who was staring at him, his face pale.
"David,
Riley said slowly.
we need to get out of here."
David nodded, starting the cruiser. As they drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but the street behind them was empty, the old house standing silent and dark. As they turned the corner, David could have sworn he heard the whispering again, faint and echoing through the night. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He had a feeling that he would never forget that voice or the darkness of the old house on Maple Street. For weeks, David couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, heard her voice telling him to leave. He started avoiding Maple Street, even during the day, the memory of that night haunting him. He wasn't the only one. Riley had requested a transfer, and Kathy swore she could still hear the whispering on the radio late at night when the station was quiet. Eventually, David took an early retirement. He moved to another town far from Birch Hollow, hoping to escape the memories. But every so often he thought he heard it. A faint whisper, a hollow voice calling his name.